We've reached 3 million views on the Gen Alpha Melody video, which is, I expected 5 million views, but 3 is alright. I've loved reading you guys' comments, so I thought I would make a video answering some of your questions and going through how I made the video. You can sort of see it as like a 50K special. Now that that's out the way, let's answer some frequently asked questions. And if I didn't address your question, just ask it again in the comments. So first of all, a lot of you guys have asked how I found these different examples. The project started in 2025 when I began compiling the different examples after listening to APT and thinking I'd heard that song before. I'd also noticed the similarities between Sophia by Clairo and Ode to the Mets by The Strokes. The comment for all of these examples were that I really loved the sound of them. They really resonated with me in almost every context they were played in. And that made it easy for me to distinguish the melody when listening to music. I listen to a lot of music. I've listened to over 15 albums. I began compiling the songs, and I didn't really think too much of it because I was concurrently doing some other music research as I was finishing my master's degree in musicology. When I finished my master's thesis, I'd just done 6 months of researching, so I was itching for another project. And then I remembered that compilation I'd been making on the side. At that point, I'd gathered probably around 20 examples just from listening to music. And it began to seem kind of uncanny. I'd also been talking to friends about this, but it was kind of hard to communicate without showing. You know, a melody that goes, wah, 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 wah. No, not really. It's used a lot in pop music, actually. Oh yeah? Which songs? Too many questions. So I had a thesis statement. Why do so many songs from around 2020 sound alike? And to answer that question, I needed a metric to analyze these songs. I knew it wasn't just a chord progression, but a specific melody. So I had to develop a metric to analyze. In other words, I couldn't just answer the thesis statement with, they just do, okay? I found the common denominator in the songs I had found to be these 4 anchor points in the melodies, or pillars as I call them in the video. But I knew there were more songs out there because once I saw the pattern, they just seemed to appear everywhere. And it sort of became an obsession of mine to find as many examples as possible. Methods I also used for this was looking at Reddit threads, Instagram posts, or TikTok videos where people were comparing 2 or 3 songs. Especially looking at the comments of these videos was very helpful. ChatGPT or any other language learning model do not work for this type of thing. I wish it did. It would have saved me months of research. But from my experience, AI really sucks when it comes to finding patterns in music or just music theory in general. 95% of the answers are just completely wrong. Because robots can't hear. They can only read Reddit threads. It's great. AI is great for other things though. Look at this. Me and Harry Potter. It looks so real. After gathering all the songs, I had the empirical data, or the songs that supposedly sounded alike. The empirical data consisted of 100 to 200 songs. The difficult part was then listening to if they actually contained the different pillars, how many of them they contained, or if they didn't contain any at all. Because most of the examples named in the videos or threads were wrong or anomalous in correlation to the analysis metrics. It took a long time to do, but this was how I found the examples and outliers. And it was honestly so much fun, and it's been even more fun going through all the examples you guys have left on the comments of the video. I've added the ones who include the 4 pillars to the Spotify playlist, which is linked in the description. And please, if you have any more examples, put them in the comments. This also leads me to the next frequently asked question, which is, isn't this just a chord progression? Okay, so leaving out talking about chords in the video was a very deliberate decision. It's much easier for people to comprehend if a melody is being copied as opposed to a chord progression because, first of all, even if you know music theory, chords are quite difficult to distinguish because you can't sing a chord progression. It's just more about the feeling they invoke, exemplified by how difficult it is to explain a chord progression to somebody as opposed to just singing a melody for someone. Second of all, you can't really copyright a chord progression. The Axis of Awesome showed it best with their 4-chord song, but even with those songs, I would argue nobody would say I'm Yours by Jason Mraz and Don't Stop Believing by Journey are copies of each other, or even that they sound alike, even though they share the exact same chords. And lastly, and most importantly, the 63 examples with the 4 pillars compiled in the video have different chord progressions, meaning the similarity between the tracks are not attributed to the harmony or the chords, but rather the melody itself. However, the melody fits well over certain chord progressions because the pillars of the melody are either the root note or the third, which are like the basis of the chords. So you could say the chords are implied by the melody. The most used chord progressions are especially the last one's very interesting because it's what's called the 2-5-1-6 and it's built up by movement in fifths, and it's also very common in jazz. This is interesting because a lot of people have cited the Gen Alpha melody to just being the circle of fifths and therefore not a new discovery and a centuries old phenomenon. And even though I can see how that misunderstanding could be made, that is not what characterizes the Gen Alpha melody. The 2-5-1 is again a chord progression and not a melody, supported by the fact that I've found no jazz standards with that exact melody, even though almost all jazz standards include a 2-5-1 or include that chord progression. And I listen to a lot of jazz. Again, I've listened to over 15 albums. Following that, the song Autumn Leaves is mentioned a lot because it's arguably the most famous jazz standard. Autumn Leaves has a different melody, but the same chord progression, and the melody outlines the chords as well, similar to how the Gen Alpha melody outlines the chords. But the difference lies in how the melody to Autumn Leaves follows more of a stepwise movement, where we to pinpoint the pillars of that melody. Fly Me to the Moon is another song which has also been mentioned a lot and is also a jazz standard. And this one's interesting because it follows the exact same melodic movement if we again pinpoint the pillars of that melody. It's built up by two sequences of moving fifths, which is also the case for the Gen Alpha melody. It's basically the same melody, but starting from a different note or a different pillar. You can say that Fly Me to the Moon is the Gen Alpha melody, but sequenced, to use a musical term. But Fly Me to the Moon still doesn't fit the Gen Alpha melody pillars. If it did, it would sound like this. A lot of you have commented on how I've missed Viva La Vida by Coldplay. Do I look like I've never listened to Coldplay? But no, it doesn't fit into those four pillars, which is why I didn't include it. But it sort of follows the same melodic movement with the fifths, so I can totally see why you would think that. But it doesn't share the same pillars, so it's again just a chord progression. Feliz Navidad has also been mentioned a lot, which is hilarious. Thanks for pointing this out. But it's the same thing as Fly Me to the Moon. It's the same melodic movement, but it starts on a different degree. But, very important. This is just based on my metrics of what makes the Gen Alpha melody. If you think some of these songs sound alike, feel free to do so. There's this accusation popping up in the comments about me being a Nepo baby or like a industry plant, because it was my first video, and yes, it was my first video, but just because my dad has an executive role at YouTube, it doesn't mean it helped me in any way. It's just like a safety net. However, I don't have any connections to anyone at Instagram, which is clearly showcased by these numbers. So if anyone could link me up with any representative or higher ups at Instagram, that would be great. Why is it called the Gen Alpha melody? It's named after the period the songs were released, and I figured considering most of the songs were from pop music, the target audience of the songs are Gen Alpha. Another name I considered was the COVID-19 melody, but it didn't really bring back great memories. The thing I was hoping for before uploading the video was finding examples from classical music using those four pillars, to find the oldest examples. It was also what I tried to communicate with the Beatles example at the end. Not to say that they were the first ever to use the melody, but to say that there's no one answer to who used it first. However, it's still fun to see, what's the oldest example you could find. Johann Sebastian Bach has been mentioned so many times with either wrong examples or just mentioning his name for the love of the game. Vivaldi has also been mentioned because of Winter of his four-seasoned violin concertos. But similar to the jazz examples, Vivaldi uses chord movement in fifths or the descending fifth progression, but not the actual melody. You guys have found one example from classical music that follows the exact 4 pillars and can therefore be attributed to being the oldest example of the Gen Alpha melody. Big credits to YouTube user Edu Orser for finding this example. It's Romance for Violin and Piano, Opus 1 by British composer Edward Elgar. Congratulations. Congratulations to the Brits. You win. You'll never win this, but you won this, which some people might argue is even better. But thanks for watching and subscribing and all that. It's been so much fun, so keep on doing that.